Hi boys and girls, we're back again. We're getting towards the end of January here. Can you believe that? We've already gone through a month of the new year. Next week I'm going to start reading a story to you. It's a book I came across a couple of months ago. It's about a boy, a horse, a fox, and a squirrel. And it's a neat little storybook. So I'll be showing you some pictures and we'll be looking at that for a couple of weeks. And we're going to get close to Lent here pretty soon. I'll be starting another regular storybook, picture storybook during Lent. Lent's those 40 days that precedes Easter. It usually starts in the middle of winter. This year it'll start the first week of March. But we'll be spending some of February reading that storybook with the pictures before we start the next adventure story that we'll be taking care of. Today, I'm talking a little bit about woodchucks. Would you believe that? Because we've got Groundhog Day coming. Now, wait a minute. I just said I'm going to talk about woodchucks, and then I said Groundhog Day is coming. Does that make sense? Well, it does, because the woodchuck or the groundhog is known by either of those names. And woodchucks really don't chuck on wood. You know, there's an old phrase that says, how much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? Well, I remember learning that when I was a young person about your age, and I stumbled through that all the time. But we had groundhogs or woodchucks on the farm where I grew up. And there's some things about a woodchuck that are pretty important. Now, the first thing is that Groundhog Day is actually a church holiday. Did you know that? Like Christmas is a church holiday. 4th of July is not a church holiday, but Ash Wednesday is a church holiday. Thanksgiving is a church holiday depending on the country that you live in. Different countries have Thanksgiving Day on different days. New Year's Day is not necessarily a church holiday, but Easter is, and so we have church holidays. Well, Groundhog Day was called Candlemas. Now, Christmas, you got Christmas, and then you got Candlemas. Mas means simply the worship service. And Candlemas was a service in which candles were very important. And it came on what we call Groundhog Day. There was something that was kind of different about Candlemas Day, because there was a poem that talked about if Candlemas is fair and bright, come winter have another flight. Now, on Groundhog Day we talk about if the groundhog sees a shadow, you got to have a sunshiny day to see a shadow, and if he sees a shadow, then there's going to be more winter. And so if Candlemas is fair and bright, come winter have another flight. If Candlemas be dark and rain, go winter and come not again. See, if it's cloudy, you can't see its shadow. So there was an old story about Candlemas and whether winter would last or not last. But we're going to talk about groundhogs or woodchucks. One thing they do, a woodchuck is smart. He digs a hole in the ground and he goes down into that hole. Now, a bear will have a den and they'll be in their den. A rabbit will dig a little kind of den and be in, but they only have one entrance. So that if a dog goes into the rabbit's den, that rabbit can only stay back further and further and hope that it's safe enough away from it. A bear, of course, in its bear den, any dog that comes in there is asking for trouble with a bear den. But a woodchuck builds a hole down in and then farther away, a good distance away, it'll come up out of its tunnel with a hole. Now where it starts to dig, it builds up a big pile of dirt. And where it comes out on the other end, there's no dirt. You can't see it. And that woodchuck is smart. He knows that if he digs this hole here, the big one, where he comes out and sits up on top of that mound of dirt, and he can look around to see what's out there, and he can see if he's safe, and then he can start chewing on the clover grass and other things there. But if he sees something bad, he goes down in his hole. And if that fox or whatever, might be a dog, comes after him and starts to go down the hole, he knows he can go out the other hole on the other end that nobody can see. And say, now, we didn't like woodchuck holes when I was on the farm because they were hard on our machinery. You were driving along cutting some hay and boom, your wheel drops into a woodchuck hole, and you could break an axle or whatever. So you had to be on the lookout for woodchuck holes. The big ones that had the pile of dirt, if you went across them sometimes with your rake, you'd break the tines on your rake, or a baler would break on it, and you'd get stones up into your bales, and it'd dull up your it was terrible. We hated woodchuck hole, but the other one was even worse because you didn't see it, and your wheel dropped down into it, and they were terrible. So we didn't like woodchucks in our fields, but they were smart. They built a wise way on it. Second thing about the woodchuck is they have two names. Woodchuck, groundhog. That was two different names. Not one name better than the other. But the thing about this is, you have two names. Did you know that? You have your name. Maybe your name is Bob. Maybe your name is George. Maybe your name is Bill. Maybe your name is Janet or Aubrey. It could be Brooks. All kinds of different names. That's your name. But you're also known by another name. That's your family name. That's your last name. And that is a name that you share with other people, but you have two names. But you have more than that. You might be a young lad and you are a son of your parents. But you're a grandson of your grandparents, and you would be a niece or a nephew of your aunt and uncle. You have different names, depending on your relationship with other people. We also have another name as followers of Jesus. We're called Christians. We have our personal name, but we also are known as Christians. It's another name. So, like the groundhog has two names, you have more than one name, depending on who and whom you're relating to by that name. So, that's a neat part of it in terms of that. Now, there's another thing. You've heard of Punxsutawney Phil. Punxsutawney Phil is the woodchuck that's kept up in Punxsutawney, and he lives in a nice life. He lives in the library up there, I'm told, and he just comes out on Groundhog Day to come up out of his hole and to tell people if he sees his shadow or not. Now, groundhogs don't talk, so you got to kind of watch and guess whether he saw a shadow or didn't see a shadow. But either way, people put a lot of stock in him, and they know that when Groundhog Day comes, winter is getting by. That is, it's passing. And we're going to have the prospect of spring coming. Maybe within a month, maybe in 2 months, but spring is coming. So Groundhog gives us a word of hope. Well, Candlemas is a word of hope as well. It tells us that the skies are going to get brighter, the days are going to get longer, and all of that's important. So I think Groundhog Day is very important because it reminds us that we have two names, more than two names. It reminds us that we are to be messengers of hope, like the groundhog is, that we bring hope to people. And sometimes that's hard to do with all this COVID stuff that's going around, and sometimes our friends may get sick, and sometimes we may be sick. Hopefully we're not very sick, but we can get sick with it, and there's a lot of scariness about it. So we need a word of hope, and God reminds us that He hasn't forsaken us, that He's with us through this, and He'll help us to get through it. And then a third thing is that the groundhog builds his house wisely. He builds wisely. He puts up one entrance, and then he has another entrance, and both of them can be exits depending on what he needs. So he builds to be safe. The Bible, Jesus told us that a wise man will build his life upon the things that Jesus taught, and the foolish man doesn't. So the groundhog or the woodchuck reminds us to build our lives on a good foundation. Reminds us to bring hope to other people, and reminds us that we're known by more than one name. And it's important to be known by who we are so we can answer, but to be known by Jesus as well, as one of Jesus' followers. So we're going to sing a song that talks about building a wise house on a foundation like the woodchuck does, and to be hopeful in life, okay? You know this song, "The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock. Now we could sing, the woodchuck builds his house with two doors. The woodchuck, yeah, but we're not going to do that, okay? Because I don't know how to finish up the chorus on it anyway. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock. And the rains came tumbling down. Because the rains came down and the floods came up. The rains came down and the floods came up. The rains came down and the floods came up. And the house on the rock stood firm. Yeah, and we can build our houses on a firm, good foundation. Now, next week, we're going to start on our new book about the boy. And it's neat. A neat little storybook. And we're going to have a good time with that book. All right, let's have our prayer. Father, thank you for this day that you've given to us. Thank you for the woodchuck. Well, sometimes we thank you for the woodchuck. Not driving the farm equipment, we don't. But that he reminds us to build wisely. He reminds us that we are called by more than one name. And to be called by your name is indeed a great thing and most important thing. And finally, to be a messenger of hope. Help us to be messengers of hope as well as we follow Jesus. We ask in his name. Amen. Bye-bye, boys and girls. See you next week.